Summer 1943. The first trains rattled across the American South, carrying not crops or cattle, but gaunt men in field-gray uniforms. They were German prisoners of war, pulled from the smoking ruins of Tunisia and Sicily, from beaches where the desert sun had baked their bones thin. Their arrival was marked not by chains and clubs, as some had feared, but by the scent of barbecue drifting from small towns they passed. It clung to the air like a cruel taunt. Roasted meat carried on the wind to men whose last taste of protein had been little more than watery horse stew. The soldiers sat pressed together, ribs showing under sweat-darkened shirts. Hunger had become their common language. In Russia they had chewed raw potato peels. In Africa they had stretched thin tins of sardines across squads. Some of them still carried the smell of rot from the trenches, a reminder of meals that had been nothing more than shadows of food. One prisoner, Hans Muller, leaned against the wood-paneled train wall and muttered to his seatmate, "If this is the end, I hope America has coffee." His dry humor earned him a tired smile, though no one really believed such luxuries awaited them. The truth was stranger. America had prepared for their arrival with both barbed wire and butter. The Geneva Convention demanded fair treatment, but the U.S. had gone further. Rations planned for each man topped 3,000 calories per day. By comparison, the Wehrmacht soldier on the Eastern Front had often scraped by on half that. The arithmetic of war, reduced to calories, meant the enemy would be eating better in prison than on the battlefield, and in many cases better than their own families back home. When the train slowed through Georgia, a few farmers leaned on fences to watch. They expected monsters, but what they saw were hollow-eyed boys barely older than their own sons. Dust rose, mingling with the smell of fried chicken from a trackside diner. One German, Karl Brenner, a baker before the war, closed his eyes and inhaled deeply. The scent of yeast and grease nearly undid him. For years, bread had been the measure of his life. He had baked it, rationed it, stolen crumbs of it. In Russia, bread had been a currency. Here, he wondered if loaves were given away like sermons on Sunday. The prisoners expected beatings, humiliation, and starvation. Instead, on their first night, they were herded into a mess hall and handed tin trays piled with meatloaf, potatoes, beans, and even slices of white bread so soft it felt like cake. Some hesitated, certain it was a cruel trick. Hans stared at the bread as if it might vanish, then laughed under his breath. "Gentlemen," he whispered, "we are clearly in the wrong army." The first bite was both nourishment and betrayal, a taste of something that shouldn't have belonged to men who had come to kill Americans. Captain Richard Thompson, who oversaw their transport, noticed a mix of suspicion and awe on their faces. He had fought in North Africa, had seen what hunger did to men, but it was still odd watching prisoners glance nervously at food as though it were dynamite. Later he would remark, "They looked like wolves at a banquet, half ready to pounce, half ready to starve just in case it was poisoned." That night, as trays clattered and spoons scraped, the hall hummed with something unfamiliar. Laughter rose, tentative at first. A man licked gravy off his fingers. Another pocketed a slice of bread to hide beneath his mattress, unwilling to believe it would be there again tomorrow. Hunger makes memory stubborn. They had learned not to trust abundance. Yet even in disbelief, something shifted. For men who had measured survival in crusts and turnips, this sudden feast felt less like imprisonment and more like a strange rebirth. The irony was bitter. They had lost their freedom, but gained meat, fruit, and even the promise of chocolate. What they could not know, not yet, was that this abundance would be more than kindness. It would become a quiet weapon, a steady erosion of certainty. For when the enemy feeds you better than your own nation ever did, loyalty begins to taste different. And as Hans finished his first plate in silence, staring at the soft bread with almost religious focus, he muttered a line that would echo in the ears of those who heard it. "If this is prison, may I serve life?" The first days in the camps were like stepping into a parallel universe. For men who had lived on black bread and watery cabbage soup, the mess hall in Texas or Georgia might as well have been a royal banquet. Long tables groaned with platters of food, steam rising from potatoes drowned in butter, meatloaf sliced thick enough to make a soldier weep, bowls of beans, pitchers of milk, and soft white bread stacked like bricks of plenty. A few men crossed themselves before eating, not from faith, but from disbelief. The Americans, bound by the Geneva Convention, gave their prisoners the same rations as their own soldiers. That meant nearly 3,000 calories a day, meat several times a week, fruit and vegetables in abundance, and, on rare occasions, chocolate or ice cream. In Germany, civilians back home were boiling turnips into watery mash, and soldiers at the front line often ate horse meat or nothing at all. Here, the irony was so sharp it cut deeper than barbed wire. They were captives, yet in some twisted inversion of fate, their stomachs were freer than they had been in years. Hans Muller sat at the long wooden table one noon in Georgia, staring at a bright orange wedge on his tray. "What is this?" he asked in suspicion. "An orange," the American guard said flatly. Hans rolled it between his fingers as though it were a grenade. He peeled it slowly, juice running down his hands. The color dazzled him, sunlight trapped in rind. He popped a segment into his mouth and blinked in shock. "Mein Gott," he muttered. "It's like eating the sun." For a man raised on rye bread and apples that browned in cellars, the sweetness was an epiphany. Karl Brenner, the baker, became both critic and comedian of the mess hall. He held up a slice of American white bread one day and scoffed. "This is not bread. This is cake pretending to be bread. Look, it folds without breaking." Then he devoured the slice anyway, licking his fingers. The other prisoners roared with laughter, half in amusement, half in gratitude that such softness could even exist. The Americans were amused too, though some guards resented seeing the enemy so well fed. "They're eating better than my family back home," one Texan soldier grumbled. But discipline was strict. The United States had decided long before that cruelty would not be its weapon. Instead, abundance itself became a quiet form of propaganda. Feed a man until his belly is heavy, and you begin to loosen the grip of the lies he once believed. Meat became a recurring miracle. To men who once counted gristle and bone shards as treasures, a slab of roast beef or a fried chicken thigh was almost indecent. They compared stories at the tables, remembering gnawing frozen horse meat on the Eastern Front or boiling nettles in Russian ditches. Karl swore he had once eaten part of his own boot, leather, softened in water. "And now look at me," he chuckled, holding up a drumstick, "dining like a king of Texas." Even sweets appeared. Candy bars, sometimes Hershey's, slid across trays. Some POWs tucked them away, unsure if they should eat them now or save them as proof that such luxuries existed. Others devoured them immediately, letting the chocolate melt on their tongues. Chocolate became more than sugar. It was a symbol of forbidden delight, of America's power to turn the darkest hunger into light. Letters from home were heavily censored, but whispers carried. They knew that in Hamburg, in Berlin, in Dresden, their mothers and sisters were queuing for thin slices of bread, trading heirlooms for potatoes. At the same time, their sons and brothers were eating buttercorn and drinking milk twice a day in America. The dissonance gnawed at them more than hunger ever had. One evening, a prisoner stood in line for seconds and muttered, "If the Fuhrer could see us now, he'd send the Gestapo just to confiscate our dessert." The line erupted in laughter, though some glanced nervously at the guards. Even the Americans cracked a smile, but beneath the humor lay unease. Propaganda back home had promised them brutal torture if captured. Instead, they were eating strawberry shortcake. The more they ate, the harder it became to reconcile the two visions of the world. Which was a lie, their mouths or their memories? Captain Richard Thompson, watching from the corner, noted it in his log. "Morale high among prisoners. Food working better than rifles. They eat, and with each bite, I see doubt growing in their eyes." The banquets of captivity were not just about full bellies. They were a quiet erosion of certainty. Around every table, between bites of chicken and spoonfuls of beans, conversations shifted. A few began to wonder aloud. If America fed its enemies like this, what else might it do differently from what they'd been told? And yet the POWs kept eating. Hunger has no ideology. The war would go on, but in those mess halls, each bite was both surrender and survival. They had come expecting chains. Instead, they found abundance, a weapon as powerful as any bullet. But abundance carries its own danger. For once the body is fed, the mind begins to crave other freedoms. And in those camps, the greatest hunger was only just beginning. The war was fought with rifles and tanks, But in the American heartland, another battlefield appeared, lined with tables, not trenches. By 1944, the POW camps had settled into rhythm. Barbed wire and guard towers defined the horizon, but inside, life followed the clock of meals. Breakfast bells rang like church chimes, summoning men not to sermons but to platters of eggs, bacon, and hot coffee. Lunch carried fried chicken or stew thick with beef. Dinner was potatoes, milk, sometimes pie. It was abundance in the shadow of war, and it carved deep rifts in the minds of men who had learned to equate hunger with loyalty. For Hans Muller, every bite was a betrayal and a blessing. He thought often of his mother in Hamburg, her hands cracked from queuing hours for bread that grew smaller by the week. He would stare down at his own tray. Steaming beans, soft bread, maybe even a peach half swimming in syrup, and feel guilt coil in his stomach heavier than any meat. One evening, he slipped an untouched orange into his pocket, whispering to himself that he would carry it back across the ocean, back to her. But he knew the fruit would rot before then. His guilt ripened faster than the orange. Karl Brenner had no patience for guilt. A baker by trade, he saw food as the only truth left in the world. He made sketches of loaves his notebook, recording textures and smells like a man writing scripture. When the Americans let prisoners work in camp kitchens, Karl volunteered. Soon he was kneading dough again, laughing with guards over flour-dusted counters. Strange war, he told Hans, where the enemy feeds you better than your own fatherland. Hans didn't laugh. For Karl, bread was bread. For Hans, bread was betrayal wrapped in butter. Statistics gave the situation a cruel edge. By 1944, the United States was producing nearly half the world's meat supply. German cities, bombed and blockaded, were cutting rations to near starvation levels. A German civilian might get 3 ounces of meat a week. In an Oklahoma camp, a prisoner could eat that much in one meal. News trickled in through letters, censored but still heavy with hints of want. We boil turnips now. Children cry for milk. The prisoners carried those words in their pockets like stones, weighing down every feast. Captain Richard Thompson understood the irony. He'd seen the lists, the calories, the endless deliveries of food. We fight them with bullets overseas, he wrote in his journal, and with butter here. He noticed a quiet change, too. At first, the Germans sat stiffly, spine straight, eyes guarded. But over months, they softened. They learned English words from the cooks. Pie, gravy, refill. They teased one another in broken phrases, clapping backs, trading jokes. The table, once battlefield, had become something else. A neutral zone where suspicion dissolved into appetite. Yet not everyone surrendered so easily. Hans kept his distance, refusing to learn more than a few English phrases. He ate in silence, chewing methodically as if discipline alone might keep him tethered to his homeland. Food fills the stomach, he told Karl one night, but it cannot fill loyalty. Karl, licking sugar from his fingers after tasting American donuts, replied, "Maybe loyalty was never meant to starve us." Humor broke tension often. When a guard warned a group of prisoners to pace themselves at a Thanksgiving feast, one German joked, "Careful, or we'll need bigger uniforms before the war ends." The laughter was real, but beneath it lay unease. What did it mean that they could joke with their captors while their own families scraped by in bombed-out kitchens? The contrast tore at them. Food had become more than sustenance. It was ideology plated with gravy. Every meal was a silent lesson. This is how America treats its enemies. Some prisoners resisted the lesson, clinging to propaganda. Others, like Karl, embraced it, letting sweetness replace suspicion. And some, like Hans, sat caught between the two, torn between the hunger of his body and the hunger of his conscience. In the end, the camp was not just a prison of wire, but of questions. Could loyalty survive on empty stomachs? Could hatred endure while sharing pie with a guard? Each bite became a quiet test. As winter turned to spring, one truth became harder to ignore. The war was being fought on their tongues as much as in the skies. And yet, as they swallowed meat and memory together, another thought whispered at the edges of their minds. If food could change the way a man thought about his enemy, what else might it change? The answer would come with the last great feast, when abundance no longer soothed but unsettled them most of all. The war ended not with a bang inside the camps, but with a feast. May 1945 brought rumors first, then confirmation. Germany had surrendered. Guards walked among the barbed wire with news that echoed louder than any siren. Some prisoners wept. Some stared at the ground in silence. And that evening, the mess halls filled with a victory banquet that blurred the line between captor and captive. Tables sagged with roast beef, glazed ham, potatoes swimming in butter, fruit stacked like pyramids, and cakes frosted so thick the knives stuck. Then came the marvel. The Americans handed out chocolate bars, not ration slivers, but full Hershey's wrapped in shining foil. Hans Muller sat with one in his hand for a long time. The foil crinkled softly, like paper from another world. He thought of his sister in Hamburg, her body thinned by hunger, her letters filled with silence between lines. He could not eat it without shame. Finally, he broke the bar in half. One piece he slipped into his pocket, a relic for the journey home. The other he let melt on his tongue. Sweetness, foreign and overwhelming, filled him until his eyes watered. For her, he whispered, though she would never taste it. Carl Brenner stood at the camp kitchen counter, kneading one last loaf from American flour. He shaped it carefully, as though it were a gift for no one in particular, just a memory of what bread had once meant. Strange war, he said softly, flour dusting his arms, that I leave heavier than I came, yet lighter somehow. Around him, laughter mixed with clinking cups. Prisoners toasted with milk as if it were wine. Captain Thompson watched them from the doorway. He saw enemy soldiers eating like farmhands at a wedding supper and wondered if history would remember this battlefield of tables. We gave them more than food, he thought. We gave them the taste of a different world. The feast was more than calories. It was a quiet declaration of power, an unspoken message. America did not just win with bombs and rifles, but with abundance, with the ability to turn even chocolate into diplomacy. For the prisoners, each bite blurred the boundaries of belief. If the enemy could be this generous, then what else had been a lie? That night, as twilight settled over the camp and men licked the last sweetness from their fingers, the truth crystallized. From starvation to feast, from gnawing bones to chocolate bars, they had crossed more than an ocean. They had crossed into a new understanding. The war had ended, but in that twilight, with chocolate melting like dusk on their tongues, many Germans tasted not only sugar but the faint, aching possibility of a different future.